The winter sun was just beginning to spill pale gold over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the 30 floors of Ashford Medical Holdings. Inside the boardroom, polished wood gleamed under recessed lights, and a half-dozen executives leaned toward glowing screens, their voices low but urgent. Moving quietly along the edge of the room was Lorraine Parker, a black cleaning lady who most barely noticed. But that morning she saw something no one else did. The man at the head of the table, Daniel Harcourt, CEO of a billion-dollar healthcare empire, was struggling. Not in his voice, which still carried authority, but in the subtle betrayals of his body. His right hand trembled just enough to spill coffee on his cuff. His eyes lost focus for a heartbeat too long before snapping back. Lorraine had been a nurse for 15 years before the world decided to strip her of that title. But skill like hers doesn't fade, it waits. And now it was telling her something was very wrong. Around the table, no one noticed. No one wanted to notice. They kept talking projections and mergers, blind to the signs, all except the woman mopping the floor. Later, they would say she was just the help. But before this day was over, the black cleaning lady who saw what everyone else ignored would save the CEO's life. Lorraine Parker had learned over the last 5 years that silence could be both a shield and a prison. There was a time when her voice carried weight. In the fluorescent-lit corridors of Mercy Hill Hospital, people listened when she spoke. Doctors asked for her assessments, families trusted her explanations, and patients leaned on her calm hands and steady eyes. She wasn't just a nurse, she was the one who caught what others missed. The subtle tremor in a hand, the uneven rise of a chest, the hesitation in a word. But that was before the night she asked the wrong question in the wrong room. It had been late past midnight when she walked into the med station and saw Dr. Leonard Carver signing off on another prescription for oxycodone. The patient's chart was open on the desk, a middle-aged black man, post-surgery, reporting severe pain. Carver's dosage was half of what Lorraine had seen given to white patients with the same injury. She spoke up. "Doctor, this dosage isn't enough. He's in pain." Carver didn't look up from the chart. "Pain perception differs," he said flatly. "We don't want to encourage dependency." Lorraine had heard enough of those coded excuses in her career to know exactly what it meant. The next day, she began documenting every case, every dosage discrepancy, every chart that told the quiet story of a system that assumed black patients could endure more pain or didn't deserve the same relief. Over months, the evidence grew into 200 pages of patterns and cold facts. When she finally brought it to the hospital board, she believed naively that truth would matter. The meeting had been in one of those long, polished rooms that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Dr. Carver sat at one end, arms crossed. The hospital director, Dr. Evelyn Hart, sat at the other, flipping through Lorraine's binder. Hart didn't even finish the first section before closing it with a sharp snap. "You're accusing a respected surgeon of systemic bias," she asked, her tone icy. "I'm showing you documented evidence," Lorraine replied. "Over 15 years I've seen this pattern. It's harming patients." The response was a smile without warmth. "Perhaps your personal feelings are clouding your judgment, Ms. Parker." It wasn't long before rumors began to spread. She was emotional, unstable, difficult to work with. Then came the accusation, an unproven claim that she'd violated medication protocols. No hearing, no chance to defend herself. Just a curt letter ending the career she'd built since she was 22. The day she turned in her badge, Dr. Carver passed her in the hall. He didn't stop walking. "Some places," he said without looking at her, "just aren't for you." Those words had settled in her chest like a stone she couldn't spit out. Now, 5 years later, she was mopping the floors of Ashford Medical Holdings, a billion-dollar healthcare empire whose CEO was Daniel Harcourt, the same Daniel Harcourt whose company manufactured the opioids Carver had been so quick to prescribe. Life had a strange way of circling back on itself sometimes with bitter irony. She kept her head down, but the nurse in her never really retired. Every time she saw Harcourt, she noticed more. The stiffness in his left shoulder, the pause before he signed his name, the way his eyes lost focus for a beat too long during meetings. She'd tried once carefully to say something. "Sir, you might want to get checked out. You've had a few moments lately." He cut her off with a sharp laugh. "You mop floors. I run this company. Let's keep our expertise separate." It wasn't the words that stung, it was the ease with which he dismissed her humanity. That night in her one-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, Lorraine sat at her kitchen table with the little spiral-bound notebook she kept tucked in her cleaning cart. Every symptom, every date, every time she saw his hand twitch or heard his words stumble, they were all there, lined up in black ink. She thought about the kind of man Harcourt was. She thought about the boardroom full of people who looked right past his failing health because they were too busy chasing numbers. And she thought about what it meant to save someone who would never thank you. Her pen moved before she'd fully decided what she was doing. She wasn't writing a medical report, those days were over. This was a letter, addressed to Elaine Harcourt. Lorraine had done her homework. Elaine had trained as a cardiac nurse before leaving practice to raise their family. She would understand the language, the urgency. Lorraine chose every word with precision. She described the tremors, the delays in his speech, the confusion that came in brief but telling bursts. She laid out the timeline like a story no one could ignore. By the time she finished, it was nearly 3 in the morning. She read the letter twice, then sealed it in a plain envelope. She didn't know if Elaine would act on it, but she knew she had to try. Because some promises you make to yourself, like the one to never turn away from a life in danger, don't expire just because someone took your title. Lorraine Parker had never been the type to mistake politeness for respect. She'd worked in enough hallways, both gleaming white and industrial gray, to know the difference. That afternoon, the difference was sharp enough to cut. Daniel Harcourt was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 30th floor office, talking into his Bluetooth headset. His voice was louder than usual, edges frayed with irritation. She could see his reflection in the glass, one hand gripping his phone, the other twitching against the seam of his tailored slacks. Lorraine waited for a pause before speaking. "Sir, you might not want to hear this from me, but you need to see a doctor. Soon." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the air vent. Harcourt turned, one eyebrow arched as if she'd just told him the weather on Mars. "You mop floors," he said evenly. "I run a billion-dollar company. Let's keep our expertise in separate corners, shall we?" She didn't flinch. "I understand," she replied, voice steady. "But you have symptoms you shouldn't ignore." His laugh was quick and cutting. "What's your background again?" "Advanced cleaning." The sting was real, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing it. She placed her cloth back into the bucket, bowed her head slightly, and stepped out. In the hallway, her pulse was pounding, but her mind was already working. Every minute she stayed silent was another minute his body might betray him completely. The nurse in her, the one they couldn't take away with a revoked license, was already making the next move. That night she sat at her kitchen table again, the lamp's yellow glow casting long shadows on the page. She didn't bother with her notebook this time. She opened a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not to him. That route was blocked. But to Elaine Harcourt. Lorraine had learned a long time ago that sometimes the person you need to reach isn't the one in the spotlight, but the one who sees the man when the cameras are off. Elaine had been a cardiac nurse before her marriage. She would recognize the medical weight of what Lorraine was about to describe. Every symptom was laid out in plain, precise language. The tremors, the pauses, the moments of confusion. She included the dates, the duration, even the subtle asymmetry in his pupils that most people would never think to look for. There was no embellishment, only facts delivered like a lifeline tossed into a storm. She sealed the envelope, wrote the name in careful block letters, and slipped it into her bag. By morning, it would be in the hands of a discreet courier she'd used before, someone who asked no questions. The next day, Lorraine went about her routine as though nothing had changed. She wiped down desks, emptied trash cans, polished the chrome handles until they gleamed. She didn't look toward Harcourt's office when she passed, but she noticed. She always noticed. The tremor in his left hand was worse today. He dropped his pen twice during a meeting, and when one of his executives mentioned a project from last quarter, he asked for details he'd already approved in writing. Around the conference table, no one said a word. No one ever did. The culture in that room was simple: keep the machine running, no matter how many warning lights were flashing on the dashboard. Lorraine thought about the hospital board all those years ago, how they'd closed ranks to protect their own. Different building, same blindness. By early afternoon, she was in the executive lounge refilling the coffee urn when she overheard two board members speaking in low voices. "Lane's been asking questions," one said. "Something about him needing a checkup." "Probably overreacting," the other replied. "He's fine, just tired." Lorraine kept her head down, but a quiet resolve tightened in her chest. If Elaine had read her letter, then the wheels were turning. That evening, as she pushed her cart down the empty corridor toward the elevator, Harcourt stepped out of his office. His face was flushed, his tie slightly askew. "How long does it take to clean a desk, Parker?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I like to be thorough." He smirked. You're a janitor, not a surgeon. Speed matters more than perfection in your line of work. Lorraine only nodded. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a man like that is refuse to rise to his bait. She finished her shift in silence, but inside something had shifted. She'd done her part. She'd spoken directly and she'd gone around him when that failed. Now it was in Elaine's hands. As she stepped out into the cold night air, the wind cut sharp against her cheeks. She pulled her coat tighter, the city lights blurring in her peripheral vision. Somewhere across town, Elaine Harcourt was reading a letter that could change or save her husband's life. Lorraine didn't know how it would play out, but she knew this: she'd kept her dignity, even as she'd been dismissed. And sometimes dignity is the sharpest tool you have in a fight where your voice is the only alarm ringing. Lorraine Parker didn't expect the parking garage to change everything. It was the following Thursday, a bitter wind knifing between the concrete pillars as she wheeled her cart toward the service elevator. Her shift was nearly over when she saw an older woman in a deep burgundy coat struggling with a canvas grocery bag. The woman's silver hair peeked from beneath a knitted cap, and her face carried the calm assurance of someone who'd spent her life making hard calls in harder places. Lorraine's feet moved before her mind caught up. "Here, let me help you with that," she said, taking the weight of the bag. The woman studied her hands, steady, efficient, sure, and gave a small, knowing smile. "You were a nurse," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Lorraine's grip on the bag tightened. 15 years, she admitted, waiting for the skepticism she was used to. Instead, the woman extended her gloved hand. "Dr. Charles Benton, neurology, retired mostly. I still do a little consulting in the building next door." They stood for a moment in the quiet hum of the garage, the city muffled beyond the concrete walls. Lorraine told him in careful strokes about the man upstairs in the corner office, the tremors, the hesitation in speech, the brief lapses in recognition. Dr. Benton's eyes sharpened. Brain tumor, aneurysm, progressive disease. Could be any of them, but every one of them could be fatal without intervention. Lorraine nodded, her voice low. "His wife's a former nurse. I sent her a letter. Detailed, but he refuses to listen to anyone." Benton's gaze was steady. "Then you don't give him the choice. You build the evidence until the people around him can't deny it." Over the next week, they formed an unlikely partnership, two professionals pushed to the margins, working in the quiet gaps no one paid attention to. Lorraine began refining her notebook into a structured log, time-stamped episodes, exact descriptions, duration, severity. Benton reviewed it with the eye of someone who'd spent decades watching diseases unfold in real time. "Your documentation is meticulous," he told her one afternoon in the corner booth of a small cafe near the building. "Better than half the charts I've seen in hospitals." Lorraine almost smiled. Old habits die hard. Benton didn't just validate her observations, he added weight to them. He explained how subtle asymmetry in the pupils could signal increased intracranial pressure, how certain speech delays weren't about stress, but about neurological misfires. The more they talked, the clearer the picture became. Meanwhile, Elaine Harcourt had been quietly confirming the details. Lorraine didn't know this firsthand, but she could sense the ripples. Elaine began stopping by her husband's office, more often lingering, just long enough to see him fumble with his cufflinks or search for a word. One afternoon, Lorraine was wiping down the marble counter in the executive lounge when Elaine entered. She offered a polite nod, the kind that passed between two women who understood the silent work of observation. "Thank you for the letter," Elaine said softly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Lorraine straightened, unsure how much to admit. "I just couldn't watch it get worse without saying something." Elaine's expression was a mix of worry and resolve. "I've been trying to get him to the doctor for weeks. He shuts down every time. But I have a plan. I'll need you to keep documenting. And I'll need Dr. Benton's professional opinion on record." Lorraine agreed without hesitation. From that moment, the work took on a sharper edge. She watched every step Daniel Harcourt took, every slip of his pen, every misplaced word in a meeting. Benton analyzed her notes, sometimes adding his own observations from chance encounters in the building. They were building a case not for a courtroom, but for a moment of truth. One morning, Lorraine noticed something that made her throat tighten. Harcourt walked into the conference room and asked where everyone was, even though the meeting had been canceled the day before. When she reminded him, he looked at her as if she were a stranger. That night, she called Benton. "Today, he didn't know who I was," for several minutes. Benton's voice was grim. "That's not arrogance anymore. That's active deterioration. We can't wait. Elaine agreed. Within 24 hours, she set the plan in motion, an informal succession strategy meeting at their home with the top executives present. The pretense would lower his guard. The real goal was to force him into a setting where his symptoms would be undeniable and where a doctor was present to confirm it. Lorraine didn't know how it would unfold, but she understood the stakes. This wasn't about proving herself right. It wasn't even about justice for how she'd been treated. It was about preventing a collapse that could end a man's life in minutes. Still, as she walked home that night, the city lights winking in the cold air, she couldn't help but think about the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. A man who had dismissed her with a smirk was about to depend entirely on the vigilance of the woman he treated as invisible. And Lorraine Parker had no intention of letting him fall, at least not in the way he feared. The Harcourt estate was the kind of place that seemed designed to make visitors lower their voices. High ceilings, polished mahogany floors, and walls lined with oil portraits of stern men who looked like they'd never once asked permission for anything. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Lorraine Parker walked through the side gate carrying a tray of coffee and tea. She wasn't there to serve, it was just her cover. Elaine had asked her to help with refreshments during the meeting. In truth, Lorraine's real task was to witness everything. The so-called succession strategy session had been Elaine's idea. The top 5 executives of Ashford Medical Holdings were invited to the Harcourt dining room under the guise of discussing the company's future. But the real agenda was to make Daniel's declining health undeniable in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. Daniel entered late. His suit was perfect, but his body betrayed him. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step was being negotiated between his mind and his legs. Lorraine noticed his left foot dragging just enough to catch the rug. "Apologies," he said, his voice slightly strained. "Traffic." Elaine smiled warmly, guiding him to the head of the table. Dr. Charles Benton sat near the end, introduced as a consultant on leadership transitions. His medical bag rested quietly at his feet. At first, Daniel held himself together. He spoke about quarterly projections, acquisitions, and market expansion. But within minutes, the cracks began to show. He called the chief marketing officer by the wrong name twice. He repeated a question that had been answered moments before. When an executive mentioned a major contract signed last month, he blinked slowly and asked if it was still under negotiation. The tension in the room thickened. Elaine leaned forward, her voice calm. "Daniel, maybe we should take a short break." "I'm fine," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The sound startled even him. His coffee cup tipped, spilling across the polished surface. Lorraine moved quickly, dabbing the liquid with a cloth, but her eyes never left his trembling right hand. He pushed back from the table abruptly as if to prove himself. "I don't need a break. I can—" The sentence never finished. His knees buckled. He caught the back of the chair, but the left side of his face began to sag, his mouth pulling down like a curtain falling on one side. Elaine was already dialing 911. Dr. Benton was on his feet, voice crisp and commanding. "Possible stroke. Left-sided weakness. Get me oxygen." Lorraine didn't hesitate. She pulled the small tank Benton had insisted they keep nearby, hidden under the buffet table, and secured the mask over Daniel's mouth and nose. His breath was shallow, uneven. The executives, pale and frozen, looked on as Benton checked his pupils. Right side sluggish. Intracranial event in progress. "We need transport now." In the chaos, Elaine's phone buzzed in her other hand. She almost ignored it until she saw the name. Lorraine Washington, the cleaning woman. She answered. Mrs. Harcourt. Lorraine's voice came through calm but urgent. "I have a full record of his symptoms. Dates, times, progression. It confirms everything Dr. Benton will tell you. You'll need it for the hospital." Elaine's breath caught. "You're a nurse." "I was," Lorraine said simply. "Before people decided my place was somewhere else." She heard the rustle of papers on the line. 47 pages, Lorraine continued. Every tremor, every lapse. "I sent it to the board 3 days ago. They ignored it." Elaine's eyes swept over the executives, most of whom were still rooted in place. "You sent it to them?" "Yes, ma'am, and I kept copies." Minutes later, paramedics wheeled Daniel out on a stretcher, his eyes half open but unfocused. Elaine walked beside him, still clutching her phone. Lorraine stayed back, her presence unacknowledged by most in the room. She gathered the coffee cups, wiped the table, and rolled the cart out the side door. But as she stepped into the cold air, she knew the turning point had come. Whatever happened next at the hospital, in the boardroom, or in the headlines, there would be no going back. At Mercy General Hospital, the diagnosis came fast and without ambiguity: a slow-bleeding brain aneurysm. Surgery was scheduled within the hour. Elaine sat in the waiting room, the weight of the past months pressing down on her. Beside her, Dr. Benton laid a folder in her lap. Lorraine's notes, he said. Meticulous. Could have been used in a medical journal. Elaine's throat tightened. She'd always known Lorraine's letter wasn't just a warning. It was the work of someone who still carried an oath, even when the world tried to take it from her. Back at the Harcourt estate, the executives were already on damage control calls. Lorraine's name was on their lips, but not with gratitude. They wanted her gone, her warnings buried deeper than the truth they'd all ignored. What they didn't realize was that the story was already in motion, and once the truth begins to move, it's a force that even the most powerful men can't stop. Shakunim. The surgical ward at Mercy General smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet dread. Daniel Harcourt lay in recovery, a pale shadow of the man who had once commanded entire boardrooms with a glance. Tubes fed into his arm, a monitor traced the stubborn rhythm of his heartbeat, and a thin white bandage circled his temple. The aneurysm had been close to rupture days away, the neurosurgeon said. Another week, maybe less, and no skill in the world could have saved him. Elaine sat at his bedside, her hand resting lightly on his. Her thoughts kept circling back to that voice on the phone, steady, unshaken, reciting symptoms with the precision of someone who knew every inch of a patient's decline. Lorraine Parker. The woman Daniel had spoken to like a shadow in the room. By the second day, the story had leaked. At first, it was just whispers in the medical community the billionaire CEO saved because a cleaning woman recognized the signs no one else saw. But then the emails surfaced Lorraine's 47-page report to the board, complete with timestamps, medical observations, in a prognosis that matched the hospital's diagnosis, word for word. The executives' responses were damning. One dismissed it as employee paranoia. Another suggested she be terminated for overstepping her role. When those lines hit the news, the firestorm began. Black Cleaner Saves CEO who ignored her warnings blared across headlines. Morning shows debated it, talk radio buzzed with callers sharing their own stories of being underestimated. Social media turned her name into a rallying cry. Through it all, Lorraine kept to her routine. She still arrived at Ashford Medical Holdings at dawn, still pushed her cart down the same halls, still polished the same chrome handles. But the way people looked at her had changed. Eyes lingered now, not with dismissal, but with a kind of quiet recognition. It wasn't gratitude she was after, it never had been. But there was something about walking into a room and no longer being invisible that felt different. On the fourth day after surgery, Daniel asked to see her. Elaine found her in the lobby, standing near a column, as if deciding whether to step forward or fade back. "He's awake," Elaine said gently, "and he's asking for you." Lorraine followed her into the room. Daniel's eyes met hers immediately, though they seemed unsure how to hold the gaze. His voice was raspy. "You saved my life." She stood at the foot of the bed. "I tried to save it weeks ago. You made that harder than it needed to be." "I know," he whispered. His eyes were wet, the lines around them deeper now. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "You don't," she agreed. "But I didn't do this for you. I did it because saving lives is who I am. That's not something anyone gets to take from me." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the weight of that truth pressed harder than any surgical bandage. Outside the hospital, the public pressure was mounting. News crews camped outside Ashford's headquarters. Protesters carried signs demanding the resignation of the executives who had ignored Lorraine's report. The board called an emergency meeting not to praise her, but to contain the damage. It didn't work. Elaine had kept every piece of correspondence, every ignored warning. She'd also kept recordings of closed-door meetings where Daniel's condition was mocked and Lorraine's credibility torn apart. When those recordings reached a journalist at the Washington Sentinel, the story stopped being a corporate embarrassment and became a national reckoning. By the end of the week, 2 top executives had been fired for discriminatory conduct. Ashford announced a sweeping review of its internal policies. Daniel, still in recovery, stepped down temporarily, citing medical leave. But everyone knew it was more than that. The strangest part, Lorraine thought, was how quickly people wanted to make her a symbol. Invitations to appear on television, offers for book deals, requests to speak at conferences, they flooded in. She turned them all down. One reporter caught her outside the building and asked why. Lorraine simply said, "I'm not interested in being a story. I'm interested in making sure people stop ignoring the ones who see what's right in front of them." Still, change was happening, whether she wanted it or not. In the staff lounge, junior employees now sought her out for advice, not just small talk. Her name appeared in company-wide memos about diversity and inclusion. And somewhere deep inside her, past the years of dismissal and humiliation, a small ember of satisfaction began to glow. Not because she'd won, but because the truth had finally been louder than the lies. The day before Daniel was discharged, Elaine found Lorraine in the hospital garden, standing beneath a maple tree just beginning to turn red. "I think you should be there tomorrow," Elaine said. "When he leaves." "Not for him, for you." Lorraine considered it. She wasn't sure she wanted her face in another round of photographs, but she also knew this was the kind of ending you didn't get twice. The next morning, when Daniel was wheeled through the hospital's sliding doors, cameras clicked in rapid bursts. He stopped to reach for Lorraine's hand, and for the first time didn't try to fill the silence with words. They stood there, two people whose lives had collided in a way neither could have predicted. One had been forced to see beyond his own pride. The other had proven once again that dignity is its own kind of power. 6 months later, the air inside the National Museum of African American History and Culture was hushed but alive with anticipation. The great hall shimmered with soft golden light, and every seat was taken. On the stage behind a podium adorned with fresh lilies stood Lorraine Parker. Her cleaning uniform, navy blue with the faintest fray at the cuffs, was framed in glass. Beside her, a brass plaque beneath it reading, "The uniform of a woman who proved that competence has no color." Daniel Harcourt sat in the front row, a cane resting beside his chair. He still moved slowly, the residual effects of surgery visible in his measured steps, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Elaine sat beside him, her hand folded over his. Lorraine adjusted the microphone, her voice steady, but rich with the kind of weight that only lived experience can carry. "For 15 years, I was a nurse. For 5 years after that, I was treated as if I were invisible. But I've learned something. I never stopped being what I was, someone who saves lives. That's not a title you get from an employer. It's a truth you carry inside you." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the audience. "Some people will only see your uniform, your role, your place in their world. But that doesn't change your place in your world. The work you do, the life you live, that's yours to define." The applause began softly, then swelled until it filled the hall. Daniel was the first to rise, his hands trembling, not from illness this time, but from emotion. When the ceremony ended, Lorraine stepped down from the stage, the medal at her collar catching the light. She walked past cameras, past outstretched hands, her expression one of quiet peace. Outside, the winter sun caught the glass of the museum, turning it into a wall of gold. Life has a way of testing the truth we carry inside us. There will be times when the world refuses to see you, when your worth is measured by shallow eyes and short-sighted hearts. In those moments, remember this: your value is not up for debate. Who you are and what you're capable of does not shrink to fit someone else's limited vision. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving them wrong, it's living so fully, so fiercely, that their judgment no longer matters. If this story touched you, share your own moments of being underestimated in the comments. Let your voice be heard, because every shared truth is a thread in the fabric of our collective strength. And if you believe in stories that honor the unseen and celebrate quiet courage, subscribe to this channel. There are more voices to lift, more truths to tell, and together we'll make sure none of them are forgotten.